History is often written by the victors, and for centuries, the story of the transatlantic slave trade has been watered down, romanticized, or outright ignored. But today, we're pulling back the curtain on one of the darkest chapters of human history, the origins of the transatlantic slave trade and how it forever altered the continent of Africa. This isn't a story of faceless victims. It's a story of nations, kingdoms, and people torn apart, exploited, and left to rebuild amidst scars that still run deep. We're uncovering the brutal truths that textbooks often shy away from. So stay with us until the end, because to understand the world we live in today, we must first confront the brutalities of the past. The origins of the transatlantic slave trade trace back to the 15th century, when European powers, especially Portugal, began exploring the African coastline. Initially, the goal was not human trafficking. Explorers like Prince Henry the Navigator sought gold, spices, and routes to the riches of Asia. However, the dynamics shifted when they encountered powerful African kingdoms like the Congo, Benin, and Mali. These kingdoms were already engaged in a form of slavery, primarily a localized system where enslaved individuals were prisoners of war, criminals, or debtors. In many cases, these enslaved individuals could earn their freedom. But when European demand grew, this system transformed. By the 1440s, Portuguese ships began capturing and enslaving Africans directly. The first known shipment of enslaved Africans arrived in Lisbon in 1444. This was the seed of what would grow into an international industry of unimaginable scale. As European nations grew more ambitious, their reliance on slavery deepened. Spain and Portugal led the way, using enslaved Africans to work on sugar plantations in the Canary Islands and Madeira. By the early 1500s, the Spanish brought enslaved Africans to the Americas, particularly to the Caribbean, to replace the indigenous populations devastated by disease and violence. By the mid-16th century, the Portuguese had monopolized the transatlantic trade. They established factories or trading posts along the West African coast, where European goods like guns, textiles, and alcohol were exchanged for human lives. But this system didn't operate without African participation. Many African rulers and merchants played a role. Kingdoms like Dahomey and Ashanti became deeply involved, capturing and selling their enemies or criminals to Europeans in exchange for wealth and power. It's a painful truth, one that underscores the complexities of human history. As the demand for labor grew in the Americas, so did the scale of the trade. By the late 17th century, the British, Dutch, and French had entered the market, turning it into a competitive and global enterprise. The infamous Middle Passage became the heart of this system, a voyage that lasted weeks or months, during which millions of Africans endured unimaginable suffering. Chained in cramped holds, barely able to breathe, fed just enough to survive, disease, violence, and despair claimed countless lives before ships even reached the New World. For those who survived, life on the plantations brought relentless toil and cruelty. This was not a trade in goods. It was the commodification of human lives, a system that stripped people of their identities, cultures, and families, and it was all driven by profit. It's vital to acknowledge the role of African rulers and merchants. While some resisted the trade, like Queen Zinga of Ndango, others embraced it, seeing it as a way to consolidate power or eliminate rivals. Entire kingdoms profited from the weapons and goods Europeans offered, unaware, or perhaps unconcerned, about the long-term consequences for their people. But this was not an equal partnership. Europeans manipulated and exploited these relationships, fostering rivalries and conflicts that would weaken African societies. By the 19th century, as abolition movements gained momentum, Africa had already been profoundly scarred by centuries of human trafficking. The origins of the slave trade reveal a story of greed, exploitation, and complicity, a system born from ambition and sustained by suffering. But it's also a story of resilience. The enslaved resisted in countless ways, preserving their cultures, faiths, and dignity against all odds. Understanding this history is not about assigning blame, it's about uncovering the truth. Only by facing the unfiltered reality of the past can we honor those who suffered and ensure that such injustices are never repeated. This is their story, and it must never be forgotten. Thank you for watching. If this journey moved you, share it, because the more we know, the more we grow.